Hi, I'm Victoria Lagrange, and today I'm going to talk about interactive narratives and how to make them more immersive and engaging. So, when you were in elementary school, you've probably all flipped the pages of a choose your own adventure book, where if you chose to climb the mountain, you went straight to page 29, but if you chose to cross the bridge instead, you went to page 32. You've also probably wondered what would have happened to a character in a story if they had made a different choice. This is the idea behind interactive narratives. Mark Riddle and Andrew Stern define interactive narrative as, I quote, an approach to interactive entertainment that enables the player to make decisions that directly affect the direction and or outcome of the narrative experience being delivered by the computer system. Interactive narrative requires two seemingly conflicting requirements: coherent narrative and user agency. The three research studies I led on the reception of interactive fiction informed my understanding of the processes that make interactive narratives more engaging. The purpose of this presentation is to provide suggestions on how to improve future interactive narratives. So, interactive narratives is not just a thing of the past. Recently, we have seen many interactive narrative productions such as Netflix Black Mirror Bandersnatch, You vs. Wild, Kimi vs. the Revenant, Minecraft Story Mode, which is an interactive narrative produced in collaboration with Telltale Games, who came up with the games The Walking Dead, The Wolf Among Us, and recently Netflix put a focus on interactive narrative, and just last year they released Johnny Test, Stretch Armstrong, Spirit Riding Free, co-produced with DreamWorks, and The Last Kids on Earth. In terms of video games, Don't Nod Entertainment produced the Life is Strange series, while the highly popular and highly controversial studio Quantic Dream created Heavy Rain, Beyond Two Souls, and Detroit Become Human. I could add many more to the list, but I will stop there. Sure, there are tons of interactive narratives, but they are not all equal in terms of immersion, identification to the character, and to be perfectly honest, they can sometimes get a bit annoying for the players. When you make a choice and the program obviously overrides each choice by forcing you to make a different one, if you've played Black Mirror Bandersnatch, you've probably experienced this, or when you try to find clues by talking to characters and they always repeat the same line, in Telltale Games Back to the Future 4, for example. So the question is therefore not how do we write interactive narratives, but how do we make them better, more immersive, more individualized, and more entertaining. I argue that interactive narratives benefit from strong player agency that lead to greater immersion and therefore more enjoyment. In order to make interactive fiction more enjoyable, we first need to identify the pitfalls of interactive narratives or story-driven games. Based on my research on the reception of interactive narratives, I have found that there are four main traps into which the game narrative designers fall when they write interactive narratives. The first one I have identified is the lack of replayability. As a game narrative designer, you want the players to play the story multiple times. If the whole game can be shown on YouTube, the studio won't be able to sell it, and it confirms the general prejudice against interactive narratives, which is that it is just a movie in which you make a few choices. For instance, when I interviewed David Cage, the game narrative designer for Quantic Dream, he said that they suffered a lot from PewDiePie's playthrough of Beyond Two Souls because players didn't realize there were many other possible choices that would lead to different events. I have seen the game, the movie, therefore I don't have to buy. The second one is the lack of agency. The player needs to feel like they are in control. In a way, the goal of the game narrative designer is to disappear and make the players feel like they are in charge. Many interactive narratives, such as Black Mirror Bandersnatch, use foldable choices, which means that if you make the wrong choice, you'll have to start again at a previous choice point. For instance, one of the first key decisions in Black Mirror Bandersnatch is making Stephen Butler accept or refuse the job offered by Tuckersoft, a gaming company. If Butler accepts the job, the game programmer Rickman says he made the wrong choice, and the player thus has to watch a shortened version of the introduction before they make the right choice. This is problematic because the player feels tricked. They had made a decision, but the narrative doesn't follow through with the decision they made. This lack of agency is also linked to the presence of obvious choices. In an interactive narrative, when the player is presented with two choices, there must be a reason for them to choose either of them. If a choice is clearly preferable, then it hinders the player agency. For instance, in Life is Strange, when Max sees David harassing Kate, the player can either choose to take a picture of the scene or to intervene and help out Kate. 84% of the players intervened, meaning there was not enough incentive to pick the other choice. This is another way in which the choice feels forced to the player. The third pitfall of interactive narrative is the lack of immersion. One of the main qualities that allow narratives to be immersive is the suspension of disbelief. The player is immersed in the story, forgetting about the real world, and focused on the fictional world. Now, the main element that hinders immersion is repetition. For instance, in Telltale Games Back to the Future 4, when Marty interacts with Biff to get Doc's notebook back, the dialogue choices the player made do not always disappear when they lead to dead ends. The player thus might reselect them and get exactly the same response from Biff. Finally, the last element, and probably the most important one, is the lack of diversity. Game studios are majorly composed of white males, and the players' demographics are not always represented in interactive narratives. Or, if they are, it is not necessarily under the most progressive angle. For instance, in Detroit Become Human by Quantic Dream, Kara, the android, is the only playable female character, and her main characteristic is that she's taking care of Alice, a little girl. The relationship of female to care is a stereotype that should be erased in subsequent game, especially because when I ran a study on the reception of Detroit Become Human, I found that while 40% of the participants identified as male, 52 identified as female and 8% as non-binary. Now that I have identified the pitfalls of interactive narratives, I will suggest possible solutions for each of them, inspired by my own research. These suggestions will hopefully allow to remediate issues within interactive narratives and inspire a future generation of game narrative designers. The first element one might want to focus on when writing an interactive narrative is replayability. This is what makes people want to buy your game instead of watching a playthrough of it on YouTube. Ryan Green, the maker of That Dragon Cancer, raised his concern when the game's view on YouTube outstripped the amount of sales in the order of millions. I quote, "For a short, relatively linear experience like ours, for millions of viewers, let's play recordings of our content satisfy their interest, and then never go on to interact with the game in the personal way that we intended for it to be experienced." It is important to keep in mind that most people don't finish games. According to Raptor, which tracks more than 23 million gaming sessions, only 10% of people complete games. Therefore, the narrative needs to be compelling enough that players actually want closure, and most importantly, that they want to replay it. Think of the average price of a video game. Most people who spend $60 on a new game want to get their money's worth. They want an entertaining, individualized experience where each choice they make can ultimately lead to a different ending. According to my analysis, there is one important parameter to keep in mind. All the characters should be able to die. In my quantitative analysis of reception of Detroit Become Human, I asked 403 participants, do you think the fact that all characters can die altered the way you played? No was 0, yes was 7. On average, participants rated this at 5.2 out of 7. When asked how, a participant responded, because your choices do affect the story, and therefore they should be decided carefully. And another one, if it had been impossible for the main characters to die, I would have spent less time on some decisions, not worrying about their storyline ending. Paradoxically, the risk of losing certain characters for the rest of the game tend to make players more focused on the narrative. Another tool that can be used for increased replayability is the visible flowchart or decision tree. All the interactive narratives have a flowchart that is how the game is written. Choice A leads to outcome B that leads to choices C and D. Usually this flowchart is kept hidden, an underlying structure guiding the narrative. However, by rendering the flowcharts invisible, players do not necessarily see how much the choices they made influence the narrative. Even if the narrative designer made sure to include multiple possible paths depending on the choices made, the player do not necessarily see how many other choices they could have made that would have led to a different ending. After Beyond Two Souls had suffered from being shown on YouTube, Quantic Dream made the decision to include a visible flowchart in Detroit Become Human. Rendering the flowchart visible has two main consequences. It shows the player the impact of their choices on the narrative, in blue, while also pointing out all the different other paths they could have taken, the ones with the luck. Therefore, if players watch an online playthrough before buying the game, it will only make them want to play it more, since they see all the choices they could have made that the streamer didn't. 82% of participants reported having replayed the game 5 times on average. The flowchart also allows players to compare their choices to those other players have made, by providing data on the percentage of people who made the same choice as them. This might seem like a detail, especially because most game narrative design manuals reference the player as a single entity without relating it to the community. However, the huge online communities of players, Reddit, Twitter, Twitch, and even Facebook, tend to go over the choices they made or didn't make and ask for advice for different playthroughs. Therefore, it is an illusion to think of the player as a single entity rather than a community. Allowing players to experience this sense of community through playing, by showing them the choices made by their friends or by other people in the world, transform the individualized experience into a communal one. This flowchart also forces the narrative designer to use as little foldable choices as possible. By rendering the flowcharts transparent, the trick is revealed. Therefore, there needs to be many different endings where each choice point influences the next, thus allowing for greater replayability. The second element I identified as a risk in writing interactive narratives is the lack of players' agency. Video games are a medium in which agency is prevalent. The user decides where to go, can pick up objects, claim quests through their avatar. However, the specificity of interactive fiction video games is that their agency is mostly directed at making choices for the character that will directly impact the overall narrative and the fate of the characters around them. Janet Murray defines agency as, I quote, "the satisfying power to take meaningful action and see the results of our decisions and choices." Interactive narratives represent a paradox in the sense that they are one of the most written type of games, but the narrative designer needs to be able to disappear, leaving the player in charge. In the study I led called Choosing and Enjoying Violence, we showed that having choices in a narrative led to greater enjoyment of fiction. Interestingly, this enjoyment of choice-making was linked to making highly violent choices and thereby creating an aesthetic zone of control detached from morality. Around 1,500 people participated in this survey. The choices on the left indicate a first low violent choice and then an apology, no violence, while the choices on the right indicate two highly violent choices. What we see here is that by being given the same story whether participants had agency, they could make choices, or no agency, the story was linear, they tend to enjoy the story more if they make choices that are highly violent. Is it problematic? Yes, absolutely, but those are the choices people make. It also shows that agency does matter to them. In other terms, the player needs to be in charge. They need to feel like they are the one creating the story, even if they are merely following paths that were designed by the game narrative designer. So people very much feel in control of the story, when they do get this narrative freedom. In interactive fiction, the choices need to be difficult, so the player is invested in the story. One of the most interesting type of choices that can be found in The Wolf Among Us and in Detroit Become Human is the tension between the character's goal and morality. In Detroit Become Human, Kara arrives at the bus stop towards the end of the game and she finds this bus ticket on the ground that belongs to a couple with a baby who need to leave the city. And she has to decide if she gives the ticket back to the couple to whom it belongs, because it is right, or if she keeps it to protect Alice, the little girl who is with her, even though it is detrimental to other people. Those choices are interesting, because they create a moral difficulty for the player that is hardly comparable to any other type of game obstacle. It is precisely the type of choice that gives a sense of agency to the players. Finally, and maybe counterintuitively, the user must be able to predict the outcome of the choices, but the outcome should be different than what they have predicted. You probably wonder why. Well, if I make a choice and I know exactly what is going to happen, then the story is not exciting. There is no engagement. However, if I make a choice and I am surprised by the outcome, it is not the one I had predicted, then the enjoyment is greater. This also means the world building needs to be very clear for the user and comparable to theirs, or very well introduced in the beginning with many points of comparison. The user is bound to create strategies based on their own encyclopedia by evaluating the possible outcomes of their choices for the fate of the protagonist. In my study of reception at Detroit, I show that people tend to think about the outcome of the choices before making them, but they feel like the predicted outcome doesn't necessarily match the actual outcome, while still very much enjoying these choices. So the third element I identified as a potential flaw is the lack of immersion, and I'm going to cut it short a little bit here, and with the fourth one as well. So what I meant to say with the lack of immersion is you want to create a world building that's sufficiently complex to get your players involved, but you also want to make sure that you avoid, feeding it to them. So if people experience your world and can understand everything immediately, that's great, but you also need to give the players who are the most interested some little snippets that they can grab. You also need to create NPCs that are complex, right? Creating complex NPCs allows to give more consistency to the game. It's particularly important in interactive fiction. And finally, the last pitfall is the lack of diversity. So we've talked a lot about Detroit Become Human here because it's, the video game I studied the most. And Detroit Become Human has been accused multiple times of tokenism by reviewers, especially, with Luther. So I included a quote referring to this. And so one thing that I do suggest for people who are interested in game narrative design is to go look at Meg Giant's talk. That's on the GDC channel. So those are, the 10 main points that she brings up. But creating complex, diverse characters is not enough. The game narrative designer should be aware of a single perspective empathy in interactive narratives. So what we showed in this study is that in interactive fiction, people tend to pick a favorite character and use the other characters as pawns to help their favorite character, even to the point of hurting these pawns. So why does that matter for diversity? Well, it is not enough to include complex, diverse characters in an interactive narrative. The game narrative designer must ensure that when there are several playable characters, the diverse characters will not become pawns for the white character. That is one of the biggest shortcomings of Detroit Become Human. Participants report much higher attachment to Connor, the only white male playable character, than to any other characters, suggesting they use the other characters as pawns to help Connor progress in his storyline. So, to sum up, through my research I identified the 4 following pitfalls in interactive narratives: lack of replayability, lack of agency, lack of immersion, and lack of diversity. I propose solutions for each one that stem from 3 different studies. To prevent the lack of replayability, all the characters should be able to die and not come back in the storyline, while the addition of the visible flowchart allows players to see that they could have made different choices, thus driving them to replay the game. To prevent the lack of agency, the narrative designer can include more choices and must make sure to not include too many cinematics. They should also conceive choices that create a conflict between the character's goal and morality, and also avoiding predictable outcomes. To palliate the lack of immersion, the game narrative designer should make sure to include complex world building and complex playable and non-playable characters. Finally, to avoid the lack of diversity, the game narrative designer should strive to stray away from stereotypes by creating complex characters while being careful about the role of pawn playing in interactive narratives. Interactive narratives is a growing field, and as such, there is still plenty of space for improvement. The possible solutions I presented here are in no way a list of prescriptions, but they are rather a list of suggestions that stem from my research for improving what is one of the fastest growing mode of storytelling. It is now up to this and the next generation of game narrative designers to be a part of this improvement. Thank you, and I'm sorry if there was any glitch in between.
All right, great stuff. Sorry we got a black screen right now, but we'll do one question and then there we go, and jump to the next presentation, which is from Samantha Sword asking, is there a recommended flowchart app or site for a bird's eye view of the flow of choices? Twine and Ink were both recommended, but do you have others?
No, I mostly use Twine. Honestly, Inco is better if you want to put your game on Unity. But not right now. No, I cannot think of any other ones that I would suggest. Those are two very good ones.
All right. Thank you very much. And we'll be back with our next presentation on art and animation in Georgia. Thank you, Dr. Lagrange.
Thank you.